So thank you very much, Maria. And I'd just like to begin by expressing my appreciation for the invitation to speak here before you tonight on the country of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and acknowledge their ongoing and rightful claims to sovereignty and self-determination in their own land. And thank you to my colleagues at ANU, all of you in the room for this honour. The invitation to deliver this lecture brings me back to ANU, which is a place that I first arrived at in the late 1990s. We met in the early 1990s. I came here in the late 1990s, and I don't. This is the first time I've ever shared this in a forum, but I know it's such a very good space here. But I found a welcoming place here because I came here as a very stressed out PhD student fleeing a violent marriage with my maiden son. And what I found here at ANU was a very welcoming space. I was taken under the wing of the late Professor Joan Kerr, and she brought me into the Centre for Cross-Cultural Research, which was then very new, now defunct. One of those things that has gone by the wayside. But it was a real turning point for me. It was a massive change in my life. So ANU really has a special place in my heart. And also there's many beautiful friends and family in the audience that also were part of my, massive life change at that point. So thank you very much. It's really exciting for me to do this. It's my great honour to acknowledge the late Professor Allan Martin, who I never actually met either, and I've also been told the same. Now, I know he was a really committed champion for Australian history, and his work helped lay the foundations for our understanding of Australia's political history in its social and human dimensions, and that was, I think, where his real gift was. Now, I came to the field as a historian trained in a different generation, with different questions about power in Australian history, questions of gender and race, which the historian John Hurst once suggested might have been somewhat disconcerting to the historian that we're honouring tonight. Nevertheless, I do see connections between Professor Martin's work and my own. And thank you for your nice comments. But I was actually thinking, because he clearly loves stories, which I also am addicted to stories. And he also has a fundamental respect for the truth. And this goes in and out of fashion with historians. But I share that. I do think the truth is really important, no matter how imperfect our quest to get at the truth actually is. I believe it really does matter. I also want to acknowledge the late Professor Beryl Rawson, who I also didn't mention. Beryl Rawson not only established this annual event to honour her husband, but she was a groundbreaking social historian of family life in the ancient world, and her work remains current today. One of my PhD students is a big fan of her work. So both Allan and Beryl were advocates and visionaries for history in public life, and their legacy is living on in this lecture series. So I'm going to get going soon, but I also want to make a very special mention of my esteemed colleague Angela Woolcott in the room. And your work and collegiality have really long inspired me, and I'm really glad to be sharing this moment with you, Angela. Certainly ANU has produced and nurtured many of the most exceptional historians in this country, and I really very much hope that it will continue to do so. And having been through some of the horrors of what you guys are going through, I feel confident that you will get through it and history will survive. So this evening, I'm going to take you on a journey with me into Australia's history, following a neglected route that connects our history of colonisation to the history of the British Empire, one that unfolds along the global circuits of empire through the lives of women whose stories have been long forgotten. And these women were the travelling ayahs and amahs, South Asian and Chinese women who travelled as domestic servants and nursemaids for British families across the empire, including here in Australia. I'll be sharing 3 of their stories with you, beginning with a woman named Pearbucks, who lived and worked in early colonial Sydney. Pearbucks extraordinarily left behind one of the rarest and most compelling voices that we have for these marginalised women in a letter that she sent across the seas to Calcutta in 1821. Pearbucks says, in essence, "Get me out of here. Get me out of this place." And she declares, "I'm treated no better than a slave." It's a very powerful letter. I'll be framing the story of Pearbucks' protest with 2 other episodes from our past. First, I'll share the story of 3 young women who may be seen as her predecessors, and they had their master hauled up before a bench of magistrates to hear their complaints. And then I'll follow up with a third story from the 1830s of a third ayah in Sydney who sought legal action against her employer. All of these women were seeking not only to get back to their homeland, they were seeking justice and they were seeking to be heard. So what's the main point of my talk? You might be thinking, what's my main point? As history, these stories matter in their own right. These women deserve to be heard. But my purpose in sharing them goes beyond recuperation and beyond rescue. I want us to reflect about what happens when we go back and revisit histories that we think are familiar and, let's say, settled. When we go back and unearth and reconstruct the hidden histories of those on the margins, the little people, the subalterns, whose lives were seen as not so important or not so meaningful to colonial projects. Never mind that they were doing the hard and essential work of care labour, what sociologists call the work of social reproduction. So what happens when you go back and look at these kind of histories again? And as I'll discuss, as soon as historians try to work with such marginal histories, we confront the fragmentary and partial nature of the sources. Filling in the gaps, connecting the dots, the points where we actually know something in an empirical sense, demands an exercise of imagination. And it's more than an imagination because in turn imagination is a vehicle for empathy. Imagination and empathy are 2 of the most powerful gifts that historical study offers us. 2 of the things most precious to the human condition and 2 of the things that the world needs more of right now, much more of. And as someone who wrestles constantly with the question of why doing this kind of difficult history matters in a larger sense than the stories themselves, that's really the point that I want to leave you with tonight. Imagination and empathy. This is what we get from history. We have to keep doing it. So let me get going. Ayah, the word. It's a word of Portuguese origin. It came to refer to the indispensable women who served British women and looked after British children in India. In India, they were often the only female servants in a society where men traditionally dominated domestic service. And as an occupational category, they emerged in direct response to the demand of European women. They were like, we want a woman working in our home, not a man. Now, I wonder how many of you have heard of the ayahs before, my talk. I'm not sure what kind of level of knowledge. Yeah, okay, that's great. How many would have you knew that some of them came to Australia or worked here? That there was an Australian side to it. Yeah. So I first came across the ayahs in India as an undergraduate studying India history, and I was quite fascinated by them. But the spark for this project was a curious family legend that I turned up while I was researching my great-grandmother Joan Kingsley Strack, or Ming as we called her. So as Maria explained to you, Ming was a passionate advocate for Aboriginal women's rights. And I traced her trajectory from an employer of Cootamundra home girls to activist campaigner in Mabel's Wainborough slot. Now, she had her own way of explaining her sympathy for Aboriginal servants. And in that way, cherished a sentimental tale about her grandmother, Maggie Goldie, who's pictured up here that way. That's maybe Goldie up there. And the story where the Maggie, born in India, was sent back to Scotland as a young child, accompanied only by her beloved ayah. Now, I found that story fantastical, even a little bit preposterous, but it stuck with me. It was a little bit of a curious story for me. Then years later, I realised there was a whole history of Indian nursemaids like that who were travelling the empire with British families. And then I became curious, did any of them come to Australia? So with encouragement from my brilliant former teachers at Sydney University, Shauman Mukherjee and Jim Maslos, both of whom we've lost recently, very recently. For Jim, we lost Jim only a few weeks ago. With their encouragement, I started digging for this history, and the ayahs were there. They were in Australian history. And that was a starting point for the project that Maria mentioned that I'm now leading with Claire Lowry and Swapna Banerjee, ayahs and amahs, transcolonial servants in Australia and Britain, 1780 to 1945, which is funded by the Australian Research Council. So in the UK, and I've got a few pictures, the picture up the top there from the UK, these ayahs are acknowledged. There's even a blue heritage plaque to commemorate them in London. In Australia, where Indian people make up our second largest migrant population today, after the English, their long historical presence is unknown. They weren't arriving in great numbers, not like the hundreds of women who were yearly travelling back and forth between Britain and India after the Suez Canal opened in 1869. But certainly they were coming, and they were coming especially in the early colonial period when there was significant maritime trade traffic between India and Australia. Now, they came here in different ways. And here we can see Australian feminist Jessie Street as a little child with her ayah, who came with her family to northern New South Wales in the 1890s. We can actually see in newspaper classifiers through Wonderful Trove evidence of the professional travelling ayahs, women who offer their services as seagoing child carers and who make multiple journeys over many years. We can find individuals like Mary Baker, a Eurasian governess, as at least how her family describes her. She came with the Gleason family and at least two other ayahs in the 1830s. There's Bibi Fatty, who came to Queensland as an indentured worker, a so-called coolie, but she quickly found work as an ayah. Others whose names have been lost to us, came on schemes to bring in servants for hire in kind of batches. Post-Federation and the establishment of the infamous dictation test, ayahs continued to come into the country in the company of their employers. And they, in that sense, they became human interest spotter for image-hungry media and subjects for strict surveillance by the authorities. Now, these women have been hidden in our history, and finding them is a slow process of winnowing records that often fail to register the presence of women or servants at all, let alone their names and their lived experiences. I've had to go back and reread previous histories and pull out the same sources that have been looked at before to shake out these precious stories. Yet they're there, and if you look, you find them. For instance, Allan Martin, in his biography of Henry Parkes, described an episode from 1854 where Parkes arranged for a group of 24 Eurasian men to migrate from Madras to work on his newspaper. Another good story in itself, and Martin tells it very well. But when I went to the shipping records, I noticed something else. Alongside these men were the names of a few women. 3 wives, a young single mother, and a 15-year-old girl, and all of them with occupations listed as servant or lady's maid. And it was in the course of following up another historical account, a story known to Australian historians as the very first failed attempt to bring indentured Indian male workers to the colonies, that I discovered Pear Bucks's letter. And so Now to Peerbucks's letter. So, not an official letter of complaint, but a plea for help from far across the seas. In late August 1821, George Chisholm, a prominent hotelier of Calcutta, receives her letter off a sailing ship recently arrived from Sydney. "Sir, I take the liberty of writing to you," it began. Peerbucks asks, could Chisholm write on her behalf to the Governor of New South Wales to get her returned to her own native country? "This is the worst place that ever could be expected," Peerbucks declares. "I'm treated no better than a slave." Chisholm then takes it upon himself to help her out, as she asks. He sends her letter back to New South Wales, enclosed with a note to the Governor, to whom Chisholm apologises for not knowing who he actually is. It's a nice little aside. Chisholm explains that the writer was a former servant in his family. And he suggests rather laconically that His Excellency might bestow a moment's attention on this poor woman. Chisholm's intercession, when it eventually gets back across the ocean again, has effect. In February 1822, under the authority of the new governor, Thomas Brisbane, a passage for Peerbucks would be found. So Chisholm was advised of her embarkation with the full consent of her master, William Brown, it was emphasised, and the words "cleared out" were neatly written across Chisholm's envelope before filing it away. And this marks the point at which Peerbucks disappears from the historian's sight. So I can track the ship, and I know that the ship made it back to Calcutta, although Peerbucks had to wait a month at anchor in Hobart at first. But it did go back to Calcutta, and presumably she got back with it and was, I hope, restored to a better condition of life. So here we have this tantalising archival sliver, the kind of material that I'm dealing with in reconstructing these stories. We hear the ayah's voice, sure enough, but who is Peerbucks? What is she doing in Sydney, and what lies behind her protest? Peerbucks's letter is indicative of the kinds of scraps and remnants of evidence that historian marginalised people is obliged to work with. We find such fragments in the scenes of stories of colonial power brokers like George Chisholm, Henry Parkes, and the colonial governors. Men who are able to exert much more power over the way their own legacies would be written and remembered. This challenge of working with such elusive historical figures as Peerbucks, whose voices come to us only in snatches on the wind, typically mediated through others more powerful than they, is a familiar one to historians of women and subalterns. The sources offer some answers, but a world of questions. And when we work with lives like those of Peerbucks, we're faced with gaps so wide that the archive seems to fall silent altogether. To begin to answer the questions, to connect the dots, I have to use imagination. Not imagination as fantasy, but as method, drawing upon patterns and context, what we know of empire, of gender and race, and of domestic service. Following the inimitable Saidiya Hartman, I propose that if we are serious about history's purpose in promoting human freedom in the present, the historian's task then goes beyond retrieving the hidden voice of silenced girls and women to just lay them before the reader. Instead, we're called to enlarge our imagination, to contemplate what might have happened, what could have happened, what probably did happen, beyond what is verifiable in an archive that's structured by erasure. Out of that imaginative work, then, comes something else, and that's empathy. The more I try to reconstruct Peerbucks' world, her options, her constraints, her decisions, her feelings, the more I find myself reckoning with her as a person. So who then was Peerbucks? Her name gives us the clue that she was Muslim. Peerbucks is a Muslim man. But the records reveal very little about her other than that. We know she worked in the home of merchant William Brown in Macquarie Place, but not how she came to be there. Her name surfaces in just one other record, which is a shipping intelligence report indicating that she was preparing to leave the colony with 3 other servants in April 1820. But she stayed. When I try connecting these dots, I find that the most likely explanation is that she stayed on to attend to the Browns' eldest daughter, Anne. Anne made an unexpectedly sudden marriage with the captain of the ship that Peerbux was supposed to be leaving on. A week later, the Mary, that's the ship, and its captain sailed out as planned, but not with Anne and not with Peerbux. So, I think she stayed to look after Anne. Another dot from the records, 9 months later. Anne is dead, but her newborn baby survives. He will live well into his 90s. The only explanation for this, the only plausible explanation, can be a wet nurse. Then 3 months later, William Brown is grieving for his favourite daughter, so his biographer tells us, and is preparing to pack up his trading business and go to his farm with his wife Sophia. The Browns' only remaining daughter in the colony, they've got a few others in India who are happily married. Their only remaining daughter is 7-year-old Margaret. She's going to be sent to England for her schooling. And Peerbux at this point writes to George Chisholm, "Help me." Well, she doesn't write herself, actually. So that's another little bit in the story. Somehow she has an ally, a friend, maybe someone she pays. It's probably a literate convict who scribes this letter for her. Do we hear a trace of the rebellious Irish accent in her works, treated no better than a slave? And then someone else too has to help her to see that that letter gets on the ship to Calcutta and gets into the hands of Chisholm on the other side. So that's something to think about. Now let's imagine that Peerbux saw no future for herself in Sydney now, and she didn't want to go farm. But the Browns were refusing to release her, or more importantly, to pay her passage home. And why didn't she have her wages, 2 or more years' worth of wages, to get her back? You know, was she enslaved? Why, we might ask, would she not have gone to the Australian governor, for the New South Wales governor, for help? And the answer here may lie in the second story that I will tell you. So this is the one that I think is going to be a bit hard for you to see for lighting. But on the slide behind me, you might be able to make up very faint traces of a shipping route. It's coming down there, and it goes right up the top to Bengal. It was undertaken in 1818. If you draw your eye up to Bengal and the Bay of Bengal up the top, you might be able to see, if you let your gaze move down, you'll see a faint grey dotted line. And if you keep following it, it arcs out to the west and across to the Ile de France or Mauritius. And then it curves down and eastwards across the Indian Ocean and the roaring Forties, stopping to collect fresh water at St. Paul and Amsterdam Islands before going on to Van Diemen's Land. And this is the route of William Brown's ship Mary, which came from Calcutta in 1818, carrying William's wife Sophia, 2 daughters, who were, I believe, Anne and Margaret, and Sophia's half-sister Jane. Also, unlisted in the shipping record, a full retinue of household servants, as well as a group of indentured dangars, and these are tribal Indian people, both men and women, who were being transported for William's farm, to work on the farm. William had established himself in a nice house on Macquarie Place, which you can actually see near the cenotaph on that picture, from where he sold the various goods that he was shipping into the colony from Calcutta. And this is the house where Peerbux lived and worked, but I don't know if she was among the many servants that came with Sophia on that arduous voyage of 2.5 months, because none of the names of the Indian servants or the labourers were listed. This is very typical. Now, I found this story by revisiting a relatively well-known case in Australian history that historian Allan brought to attention in the 1970s. Dwight traced the origins of an Australian aversion to indentured non-white labour and the roots of the White Australia policy to this particular case. To summarise Dwight's account, Brown's indentured workers complained to Governor Macquarie in June 1819 of cruel usage and ill fare. When the bench of colonial magistrates found their charges to be valid and proven, Macquarie ordered them to be returned to India, and he sent Brown the account for their passage. Brown simply refused to pay, and I'm condensing the story very quickly there. The governor took the matter to the colonies' Supreme Court, which ruled in Brown's favour, saying Brown's responsibility had ended when his Indian workers had left him and that the government couldn't pursue him for this money. Thus, Macquarie went very sour indeed on people bringing Indian workers into the colony. Now, that does immediately help us to see why, or see that Peebucks probably wasn't getting any hearing from Macquarie, who was still in charge when she wrote to Chisholm. And it helps us to understand why she had to seek help outside the colony. But there's an even more interesting aspect to this case that wasn't apparent in Dwight's account. So while Australian historians have focused on the significance of the complaints of Brown's field labourers, they've overlooked what becomes clear when you go to the transcripts of and the evidence of this case, and that is that the whole case was instigated by the Browns' household workers, in fact, and these included 3 young women who played a key role. So it's very much a story about servant protest, and that's really missing in the historiography. So these 3 women were Tamassi, who described herself as a lady's dresser, which is how ayahs were often so named, and 2 girls in their teens named Vaktin and Pari. They had arrived with Sophia in 1818, according to their testimony. They were on that big ship, that big journey, and all had been with the Brown family since their infancy. All of them complained vehemently of Sophia's physical and verbal abuse, as did many of the other workers. Tamassi, Buckton and Pari had gone to the lengths of preparing a written petition to the governor, asking him to, quote, dissolve the bond of slavery in which Mrs. Brown deems them held in order that they may return to their native country. And their petition, accompanying another from 2 of the men servants, which requested that the governor either force their master to abide by the conditions of their agreement or to dissolve that agreement so that they could return to India and, importantly, seek redress on the governor there. This had persuaded Macquarie to have Brown summons to court. That kind of not when he realised that they might actually somehow get their complaints heard in India. It was like, okay, we'll deal with it. Now, whether Peebucks had stood aside at the time of this case for some reason, because she's not in their evidence, she's not in the transcript, she's not mentioned at all, or whether she came into the country after it, there's no doubt that she would have been aware of what had transcribed, but what had transpired, and also aware of the power of that claim of slavery to get attention. Trapped and isolated as she now was, Peebucks leveraged her transcolonial connections with a former master in Calcutta to make her predicament legible and urgent to the governor in Australia. Now, the Brown family themselves are fascinating. There's layer upon layer of complexity to their story. An interstitial Eurasian family, insecurely positioned vis-a-vis the hardening social and racial boundaries in both India and Australia at the time. Sophia, the illegitimate mixed-race daughter of an East India Company captain who had married William when she was barely out of childhood herself, is dismissed by Brown's biographer in just one line. Not mentioned much must have been a model housewife, which is laughable in light of the evidence given by her servants, not only of her, violence, but also her taunts to take your complaints to the governor. Sophia says, he is the keeper of thieves and roads, but has nothing to do with me. Years later, after William dies, Sophia will marry one of her convict workers. Sophia intrigues me as much as the women she employed. How did Peebucks get on with her, I wonder? These are the kinds of relationships between women that aren't detailed in the records, but they tantalise the imagination. Now, third story is I want to take you forward now almost 20 years to the mid-1830s. And this story concerns an ayah who took her employer, one John Mackay, to court. Now, John Mackay, an indigo planter from Bengal who immigrated to New South Wales in 1836, was one of the most vociferous advocates of importing indentured Indian labourers, and he left copious words giving his opinion on this in this regard. The ayah, known variously as Bunna, Bunno, or Brony ayah, was much less voluble, although we do hear her voice very, very faintly and through an interpreter in the record. And again, who she was exactly is hard to work out from the records. The name Bunna indicates that she might have been a woman of the indigenous Bunna people, a so-called hill tribe, like Brown's Dangers, they were also a hill tribe, who Mackay preferred to employ on his plantation in India and as indentured recruits for Australia. However, the Bunnas were animus, and while Mackay's ayah was, like Pearbuck's and indeed many of the ayahs, many of the travelling ayahs, was of a Muslim faith. But neither Brony nor Bunno are Muslim names, and neither is Bunna. Perhaps she was an indigenous convert. Perhaps she was a hill tribe woman who converted to Islam. I will call her Bunna for now anyway. It may not be her name at all. Probably not, actually. Who knows? In April 1836, Bunna was hired at Calcutta to attend upon Mackay's wife, Charlotte, and their daughter, Allan, on the Mackay's coming voyage to Australia. Her 5-year contract promised a monthly wage, food and clothing, and a passage back to India, should Mrs. Mackay decide to relinquish her services within that 5-year period. The ship made landfall at King George's Sound on the south coast of Western Australia in early June. And it was here that one James Watson boarded the ship with his wife Mary to offer their services to the passengers en route to Sydney. We'll work for you if you can get us across to Sydney, that'd be great. Mackay promptly took them on. Bunna showed Mary Watson her duties, and then a few days later retreated to a longboat, saying that she felt unwell. According to Watson's testimony, Bunna didn't work for the rest of the voyage, but nor was she asked to. That's important. When they arrived in Sydney in late August, the Mackays simply cast Bunna adrift. They, quote, this is her words through the interpreter, turned her outdoors without money or food, and refused to provide her passage back to India. Now, Bunna couldn't speak English at all, and she was a stranger in the country. But she went to a magistrate shortly after arriving, and within weeks she had John Mackay summoned to court for breach of contract. So in court, at first the case seems to be going in her favour. Mackay's lawyer claimed that Bunna had refused to work, but the magistrate insists upon evidence of a specific act of disobedience. Mackay then goes, okay, and runs off to find 2 witnesses. One of them is James Watson and the other is a fellow passenger with a very mysterious name. But neither can provide such evidence. And yet, so it's pretty straightforward, but the magistrate is reluctant to press any penalty against Mackay. Instead, he tells Mackay he'll be satisfied if Mackay will just return the ayah to India, as she wants a passage back. Now, this is par for the course, really. Bunna's not going to get justice, but she will at least get back home. But Mackay was agitated by the magistrate's direction. So Mackay was then, this is like when he's just first arrived in the country and he hasn't got himself really started yet. And he was in the midst of negotiating his scheme with the colonial authorities to recruit indentured Indian labourers for the colony, by which he was paid to make his living on a commission of £6 a head. If this woman goes home, his lawyer pleads, she will damage Mackay's reputation as a trustworthy recruiter in India. and his plans will be, quote, entirely defeated. The cynicism is breathtaking. Don't send her home. She'll give me a bad name. Like, it's got to ruin everything. What does the magistrate do? Well, he dismisses the case. Case dismissed. Buna has no work, no home, no support, and no way of leaving the country. And this case occurs at a time of growing concern over the treatment of indentured Indian workers. Buna's experience will be echoed in the evidence given by one Jehuran ayah before an Indian government inquiry at Calcutta in 1838. So at around the same time that Buna was signing on with Mrs. Mackay, Jehuran, another Muslim woman, accepted a very similar 5-year contract to accompany a family from Calcutta to Mauritius. There, unpaid, ordered to do demeaning work. She was expecting to be an ayah. She ended up being a cleaner. She was repeatedly assaulted by her sadistic master, and she ended up going twice to the police without effect. They just sent her back. And the third time, she told them they could just arrest her for refusing to work, and she would wait in jail until the authorities could get her back home. Within a week of her return to India, Jehuran gave powerful evidence of the abuses not only that she suffered in Mauritius, but others. She also gave quite a lot of evidence of abuse of the field workers as well. But of Buna, I can find no further trace after the magistrate dismisses her case. I don't know how long she stayed in New South Wales or how she survived or whether she got back to India somehow and realised Mackay's fears. If she told her compatriots, as Jehuran was saying of Mauritius, and I'm quoting her words here about Mauritius, but was Buna saying that the colony of New South Wales was a country of slaves and that she would rather starve and die on the streets of Calcutta than ever return there. Buna exemplifies the challenges that we face in recovering these stories. Without certainty as to her name even, and no further details, she disappears from history as suddenly as she appeared. So these three stories mark brief moments, sudden glimpses where the ayahs become visible in our early colonial past. The histories they open up are bleak, and they demand not sentimentality, but empathy. Each story offers a glimpse of an individual life that is, of course, important in its own right. But when we put them alongside each other, when we connect the dots, a larger pattern begins to emerge of life in the early colony. That's not a pattern that we're used to seeing. A pattern of precarity, of exploitation, and the consistent failure of colonial systems to protect the very people whose labour sustained them. Loyalty met with disdain, trust with trickery, and care with cruelty. It takes imagination to construct narratives around this fragile process that must unsettle our understanding of the colonial past and reorient our viewpoint to the perspective of the powerless. And so what can we learn from these marginalised women and their marginalised histories? To borrow from one of Allan Martin's best-known phrases, or essays actually, we must resist casting them within the weak view of Australian history. And that's the idea that labour rights and women's rights and the rights of colonised and non-white people somehow inevitably and inexorably march ever forward. Oh, those bad old days, weren't they horrible? Because these stories, what they actually demonstrates how fragile these rights are in the face of greed and indifference. How institutions for the protection of the weak can be used to shield the exploiter and to protect the powerful. Human rights aren't set in stone or guaranteed, and they can be, and indeed are being, right now turned back. And it's the most vulnerable, the little people, the isolated and marginalised people who no one thinks about, who pay the price. So my paper is a call for historical empathy. We're living in a moment that I'm sure many of you have noticed when empathy is being treated with suspicion, even open scorn. At a time when the commitment to the truth of a shared humanity is being eroded, we're told that empathy is not rational. But history, real, thoughtful, informed, rational, if difficult history, demands empathy. It asks us to imagine what it would feel like to be someone else in another time under a different set of constraints and opportunities and different beliefs and values. It's for this reason I think that history is so much beleaguered and badgered today. Look at AMU. This is why it's under such pressure in our institutions and wider society, because it insists that we see the world with empathy, with complexity, and with imagination for the human condition. So if I've done nothing else tonight, I hope I'm encouraging you to keep reading history, to keep thinking historically, and to keep valuing the work of imagination and empathy that sits at its heart. Whether you're a historian by vocation or simply someone wanting to make sense of the world that we live in, history matters. So to conclude by returning to Pearbucks asserts her presence in history. I am here, her letter says, in effect. I am a worker, a woman, a Muslim, an Indian in this colony, in this country. I deserve respect and fair treatment. Pearbucks' story and the stories of the other ayahs appear at the edges of the archive, in its seams and margins, offering glimpses of other histories we don't yet know and may never know, at least in the empirical sense. In their partiality, these marginal stories ask us to rethink what counts as evidence and where imagination might open us up to deeper truths. In this way, their very elusiveness becomes the method to trace presence across absolutes, to sit with the difficulties and the margins, and to write histories that don't seek closure but connection. Thank you. Mm-hmm.